Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Hello, I'm Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. If you are listening to the show today and you are an IT business leader concerned about enterprise IT security, exponential technology trends, innovation, you're going to love this program. And today my guest is Peter Singer. Peter is a strategist with New America and an editor at Popular Science magazine. He's been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators and by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, and by Foreign Policy, the top 100 global thinkers list, and by Analytica Market Research as one of the 10 most influential voices in the world of cybersecurity. So Peter is a heavyweight in this area, and he's had a recent book called Ghost Fleet. He's had several books, which I'll link up on the show notes. But Ghost Fleet is his most recent one, which is a novel about the next world war, but it's an integration of nonfiction reality, like today technology, and then also future thinking about what the potential issues with another war would be. He's the founding director of the Center for the 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings, where he's the youngest person named to be a senior fellow in its 100-year history. Very, very impressive. So here's some key takeaways that you'll get from today. This is super interesting because I haven't had a guest cover this, but he explains on this discussion, he was on a research project that asked 60 people what the 5 trends were that were of the same magnitude as of 1980 prior to the internet going off. So of all the trends, what was equivalent to the 1980 prior to the internet taking off? And there were 5. Hardware, which was robots and autonomous vehicles. Software, IoT, big data, and AI. Here's a couple interesting ones. Waveware, energy sources, solar, and lasers. Hardware, additive printing and manufacturing, turning bits into atoms with 3D printing. And 5th one was wetware. Wetware is human performance enhancing technology. So that's one of the areas that we cover on the show. And this is an area that particularly deep interest for me. So what he's talking about with all of these is really looking at technology breakthroughs that are faster than Moore's law in the computer science side, like biosciences, which breakthroughs are coming in endurance and in cognition and concentration that will impact everything from the classrooms to high performance executive functioning. And we talk about the biology effect of internet security right now and how we take nature and how biological systems respond to threats. It's very, very interesting dialogue that we have that I know you'll be fascinated with. Before we get into the episode, just a brief message from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Red Zone Technologies, which I founded 16 years ago in 2001. Red Zone is essentially a SEAL team unit for enterprise IT security. Typically, we're brought in by top IT business leaders to assess the current state of their IT environments. IT security is complex, and we have a unique process and a method for unraveling complexity so that remediation action can be taken to address audit, compliance, or just good old-fashioned appropriate IT spending based on risk and exposure. So understanding the gaps that exist and then prioritizing what happens first, second, third, and fourth is all incorporated into our plans. Our plans are laid out on a transparent roadmap of execution with a predetermined budget. So the CIO, all the way to the board, knows exactly what to expect from staff, partners, vendors, and consultants. So go to redzonetech.net to learn more about how my team can help you. Again, that's redzonetech.net. Now, let's get into my fun interview with Peter Singer. I'd like to just ask you a couple questions just about how you got started covering the technology and war. I noticed from your books and reading material from your website and reading about presenting in front of Congress in the themes of your past two books in 2014 and 15 that you covered war and technology, and that's your focus. How did that interest develop?
Oh gosh, it's like with all things, I think it goes back to our youth. For myself, I was growing up that weird little kid, but maybe we're a little bit more typical that, at the age of 6, if you gave me a stick, within about a minute, that stick would have been magically transformed into either a lightsaber or some kind of Tommy gun, and I would be off fighting either Darth Vader or the, German invaders of our neighborhood. And the same thing, and I think about building Legos, but then attacking them with a model of the fighter jet that my uncle flew in Vietnam. It's that kind of mix. And I've always had a deep love of history. Again, I think shaped by our, by your family experience. I loved going to my grandfather's study and, pulling out the history books about his experiences in World War II. He had been a U.S. Navy captain, but then also science and science fiction. And you can think about whether that's on the literature side and the books that you grow up reading to the movies, the TV shows. So it's always been that cross that's there. When I look at now that I'm grown up, so to speak, maybe, the books that I've written have had a theme that connects them all, and they've been, in essence, on what's changing, comparing the history of conflict and technology to the present, to what's changing and what do we need to wrap our heads around. So, for example, my first book was on the rise of private military contractors, the Blackwaters, the Halliburtons that were there but really didn't fit the way we understood war. Another book was on warlord groups and child soldiers. Another book was on the rise of robotics. It was called Wired for War, where, this is an incredible moment in history, not just history of war, but human history. Robots are starting to be used, and yet we weren't wrestling with both the reality of it, but all the dilemmas. Then a book on cybersecurity, and that hits, everything from, of course, war, but it's a conflict that inherently moves on the civilian side. When you think about the experiences of anything from banks to you and I on our personal privacy levels. And then finally, Ghost Fleet is wrestling with what does this look like potentially 5-10 years out, and tries to bring these different themes together in terms of it's a novel, but it's a unique kind of novel in that it's got 400 footnotes to document how everything in it is real. So again, it crosses, for me, the fun that I had of reading early Tom Clancy, but also the nonfiction work that I've been doing, for example, consulting with the military and the like.
Yeah, it's the science fiction of the Jetsons era when I guess the Jetsons were only on TV for about 2 seasons. I just learned that the other day when I was out in Silicon Valley at the Global Summit for Singularity, and it was interesting. A lot of the things that we just used to dream about now are here, and now they're a reality. And is part of your mission to, with the trepidation in the debate around this, is it to educate and inform, or do you have a firm opinion about whether these are inherently good or bad, or you just want to be in the middle of the debate?
I see my role first as to explain and to help people understand the context of whatever the change is. And that context may be the historic context. What has changed? What has come before? The context in terms of why is it happening now? The marketplaces. When you think about the field of cybersecurity, too often it tends to focus on the technology side when we know it's how the marketplaces are organized, how the businesses and the government agencies themselves are organized that shape things more. And that's both on the good and the bad side in terms of the defense, but also, how the marketplace in terms of the threat side is organized, to the legal, moral, ethical questions that are being presented by these changes. And so what I hope to do is equip people to better understand them, and then that allows them to make better decisions. I, of course, have opinions and on, what's good, what's bad, more so on what we should do, how we should wrestle with these changes. But I think as when you're crossing in that space between analyst and writer, you need to lay out the different options. It's not just pathway one that's the only way to go. That's not being honest. not just kind of lying, but I mean intellectually honest. Instead, what you need to lay out is, here's the different pathways, here's the advantages, here's the disadvantages, and this is why this pathway seems to be the best one. That helps a reader. Now, that doesn't mean they might not disagree, go, you know what, I actually like pathway number 2, but now it allows them to understand it. I will say a position that sort of cut through a lot of my work, though, when it comes to technology itself, is that I see technology itself as neutral. It is a tool. Tools, though, can be used for both good and bad, and we've seen that pattern throughout history. Whether you're talking about the story of, the very first tool, some rock that was picked up that was used to bash someone else in the head, but was also used to build for the first time. The same thing whether you're talking now about drones or the Internet. The Internet, for example, has been one of the most powerful tools for raising human understanding, transforming business marketplaces. It's also been one of the most powerful tools for spreading hate since the printing press. It's now being used as a way to attack others. Those others might be large corporations. They might be small cupcake shops. They might be you, me. They might be nations. But again, it doesn't mean that the Internet is somehow inherently bad. You and I are using it to have a great conversation about the Internet, to hopefully inform people. So I tend to take that position in terms of the technology is neutral, but there will be people who will use these technologies in both good and bad ways.
Yeah, that's, by the way, it was interesting you were talking about where a lot of our careers are sort of had their genesis in when growing up as kids, and I do remember having battles just a quick story. I do remember having battles in the woods with my friends as well. We used to be just throwing rocks and sticks at each other and hiding behind trees. And then the other day, my 13-year-old asked me to go play an airsoft war with him and his friends in the woods. And I couldn't believe the sophistication of these little airsoft guns that shoot these little soft pellets at 30, 40, 50 yards very, very accurately. So talk about, what 40 years...
But your kids sound old school, because I was thinking, you were going to have a story of either they were going to be using, drones in some case, or, which, again, was a science fiction technology a generation ago, and now, I got 3 drones for Christmas.
Right.
But the other is the virtual side of it. What is the Pokemon craze now? Well, part of it is sort of layering technology and our experience of it over the real world, including using it to clash, so to speak, with each other. But, again, it's interesting to take this idea of the neutrality of technology and compare it to the discourse over it. And there's this, split between, it's kind of like in rap, East Coast, West Coast. So East Coast, Washington, D.C., where I'm speaking to you from, policy world looks at technology with great suspicion, fear. A lot of it underneath is just ignorance. I remember talking with a senior official who was involved in making cybersecurity policy, and he talked about how he didn't really well understand it. It was a lot like, as he described, the way his VCR still flashed 12. And I was like, well, one, right. You don't understand it. 2, you're still using a VCR. This is disturbing. But then, you go out to Silicon Valley. You go and it's technology will solve all the world's problems, whether it is war, whether it is poverty, whether it is hunger. There's sort of this blissful solution set. It's either already solving it or just wait, it will solve it. And of course, that ignores history and, frankly, the customer side, the human side. People are going to make things and break things. And so it's to help people, let's get our blinders off from both communities.
So I love that, since you really are kind of grounded in the historical pieces, I love reversing the clock and get your perspective on this, because it's interesting. I was going back to someone told me the other day that the Gutenberg printing press sort of democratized access to education, of course, and took the power of reading and writing out of just the scribes' hands and into the people. Well, when you look back at the literature of that day, it was actually quite frightening and disturbing to the clerics and the scribes, and they thought, oh my God, all these people are going to go out of work because they can no longer write endlessly. And And then someone said the other day that we have about 10, 12, 13 Gutenberg moments going on right now in the variety of different technologies. So what do you think, so from that lens, how do you look at what's going on now from an historical perspective within your domain that you spend most of your time in?
Gosh, well, the first is the question of, can you still divide things into domains like that, where something is obviously a military technology or a civilian technology or a banking technology or whatever. I mean, computer is a good illustration of how those borders are in many ways don't exist anymore. So the computer starts out as a military technology, but it ripples back and forth, affects every sector. I think we're seeing the same in a number of areas. I like the way you framed it as sort of the simultaneous nature of it. I was part of a project a couple of years ago. It was paid for by the Pentagon, but it was non-classified. And it's called NextTech. And we were essentially trying to wrestle with what are the game-changing, revolutionary, disruptive, killer apps, whatever your buzzword you want to use, what are the technologies right now that really matter? And the framing of it is that we essentially interviewed some 60 different experts, and as everything from people working at organizations like DARPA or companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, university professors, scientists, venture capitalists, people putting their money in making the future come true. And we asked them all essentially a basic question. What technology today do you think is equivalent to the computer in 1980? So it's not science fiction, it's real, but go back to 1980.
Sure,
it hasn't yet truly changed the world. And what was fascinating is they gave us so many different answers. No one agreed on the one single technology. But basically it came down to what I would describe as 5 technology bucket areas, and they're as follows. One is hardware, and more specifically robotics, and increasingly advanced and more autonomous robotics. And it was fascinating for me to look at that, because I'd done a book on robotics wired for war, and as a comparison just in the space of war, we go, you and I are talking just after the 15-year anniversary of 9/11. When our forces go into Afghanistan, we have a handful of drones, none of them armed, and 0 unmanned ground vehicles, ground robotics. Today, U.S. military has over 10,000 drones, and many of them armed, over 12,000 unmanned ground vehicles, but we're not the only player. Over 80 countries have military robotics, but of course, it's now a civilian technology as well.
Sure.
Whether you're thinking about drones to driverless cars on the streets of Pittsburgh right now. So you have hardware. Next area, software, and in particular, Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence all crashing together. Third bucket area, I call it Waveware, basically the energy side, where we're seeing new energy sources, new energy forms. And that's everything from, thinking about how the American economy is being changed by, we've become an energy producer rather than an importer. That'll continue to shift. Again, it's everything from what's happened in oil and gas to solar to hydrogen, but also energy as a weapon. Lasers were science fiction when we were kids. They're no longer. Another area is, you can think of it not as the where in terms of the location, but the where in terms of the tool. And this bucket is things like additive manufacturing, 3D printing. Again, however you want to frame it, our ability to turn bits, computer designs, into atoms, things. And what does that mean for marketplaces, production, weaponry? Then finally is the area of Wetware, and that's the idea of human performance modification, or jokingly, Captain America meets Iron Man meets the Russian Olympic athlete program. And so it's everything from the sciences shifts and what we're seeing in genomics to carrying technology on the body to technology in the body, and amazing shifts in what the human body can do. So those 5 areas, each of them happening simultaneous, and of course each of them feeding off of one another. So what's playing out in robotics is not just about the robot being able to walk better. it's its intelligence that shifts over to the artificial intelligence software side. But in turn, much of the human performance modification, a lot of it is about how do we keep up with our technology? How does it change us? So these things shifting back and forth.
So the human performance side is interesting. And so I was thinking about external exoskeletons and sort of like, I guess, when a couple Olympics ago where that guy from South Africa was running in the 400 meters with that prosthetic device on his right leg. Are you referring to a full frame external skeleton on the human body, or maybe you can explain that a little bit?
Think about, so it's literally all the different ways that human performance, what the body can do, is modified, is enhanced, is changed. So we see this in terms of at the most fundamental level in the biosciences and genomics. And, people are excited about Moore's Law, but the breakthrough in IT is much slower than what you're seeing in the biosciences. It might be through chemical changes in performance, everything from affecting your endurance, your ability to go without sleep for long periods of time, your concentration levels, how smart you are. And again, don't think of this as, super soldiers. Even very modest shifts can have significant impact. So whether you're a kid studying for class, you're a writer, book writer, or writing a memo, we don't hit our peak mental performance, our highest concentration levels, but for a very limited time out of an hour. One study I saw had it about 6 minutes out of an hour was really when you were in the zone, as you might think. And we have lots of different ways of getting in the zone: drinking coffee, listen to music, meditate, whatever. What if we could take that 6 minutes and change it to 8 minutes, change it to 12 minutes? That sounds modest. That's actually possible, and that doubling effect, what does that mean for productivity? What does it mean for the size of your, be it military unit or business unit? What does it mean for training time? Then you get to the hardware application to the human body. It might be hardware on top of the human body. You went to science fiction exoskeletons, but, think about all of us walking around, to go back to the example of the Pokemon Go. You're carrying around that phone and using it to navigate and look at the world in a very different way. In Ghost Fleet, we look at, what will come next with Google Glass. It was a lot of people had a lot of fun with it, but we all know that those kind of enhanced vision devices are not stopping with that. What about hardware not on the body, but in the body? It might be to replace something that's been lost, as you use the example of the athletes or soldiers who've lost limbs and robotic prosthetics. They've gone from being less than a standard human capability to greater than human capability. It might be in the ability to run fast. There was a gentleman a couple weeks ago who showed off a robotic arm that was inspired by the video game Metal Gear Solid. His robotic arm mounts everything from a smartphone in the wrist to a drone on the shoulder.
Oh, wow.
This is not in the year 2050. This is today. It might be combinations of hardware, software, wetware coming together, brain-machine interfaces. We've seen this, for example, the BrainGate project that was designed to help people that have been paralyzed. We've linked, it's a DARPA project. It's linked their brain up to a computer. It changes, in essence, the electric signals in your brain to digital code. And it allows the person via thought alone to do things like, for example, move a cursor around a computer screen, which if you can do that, you can navigate the web. You can write email. The thing people are weirdly most excited by was that one of the individuals was able to change TV channels by thought alone. That is not limited to people that are paralyzed. It may be in forms less invasive. We've seen, for example, using it to control the flight of drones via thought alone, kind of via wearing the equivalent of like a skull cap. It'll also go in the other direction, though. There's a project also supported by DARPA called Subnets, and it's basically systems-based, looking at neuroscience in a very different way. And in essence, just think about it as instead of your brain signals going out, it's taking digital code and reshaping what's happening inside your brain. Like so many technologies, to go back to something we were talking about before, it's designed to help people. It's designed, the medical applications range from Parkinson's to why DARPA, the military research lab, is interested in it, is to help soldiers who have experienced PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, to help them. So it in essence, modulates their emotions and their memories of traumatic moments. Very good, very powerful. But one of the things maybe the scariest scene in our Ghost Fleet book is how we project how this will be used in interrogation. And then you get these interesting, again, science fiction-like questions. Is it torture if you don't remember it or you don't actually feel it, but you think you're feeling it? Is that torture? That seems like science fiction. That is a question that we are now wrestling with.
Interesting. So it's interesting that a lot of people think that a lot of the innovation is coming out of Silicon Valley, which of course would be hard to dispute that wouldn't be the case. But then there was a gentleman that spoke at our salon 2 months ago who said that from the cell phone, of the 30 major breakthroughs that enable our current cell phones, from the GPS locations and to the variety, all of this 30, there was over 70% of them came out of the military. Some projects within the military, DARPA, or what have you, which I think most people are under the assumption that it's coming from Silicon Valley.
Well, look, there's also Silicon Valley needs to go back to its own history and remember that it was started by the military. And not in the story we like to tell ourselves of chip makers or the like, but it actually dates back to a Navy blimp base. We can have a longer conversation around that, but that's the origin of Silicon Valley, is actually essentially the big facility, Moffett Field, that you will see if you fly into San Francisco Airport, right in the middle. That's the origin of Silicon Valley, dating back to the 1930s, when the plan was it was going to be a hub for flying aircraft carriers. And the city fathers of Sunnyvale struck a deal with the Navy to provide them cheap real estate, and even naming it Sunnyvale because the idea was that it was the one sunny part of the Bay Area. So my point is that if we actually look at the real history, we look at the real data, there's always been this back and forth between Silicon Valley and the military. Sometimes it's funding, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's inspiration, and that continues to today. The shift, though, is, I would argue, kind of the advancement and the pacing. And the challenge for the government now is that it's more often reacting to what's happening out in Silicon Valley and the broader technology field. It's not just in Silicon Valley. It's, whether it's in Texas or in, if you're looking at robotics, exciting things, arguably more exciting things happening in Pittsburgh and Route 128 and Boston, you name it. We've had a very U.S.-centric discussion. It's also, things playing out in China and Israel and Sweden. But the point is that in general now, government is, at least on the policy side, struggling to keep pace. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the disputes that you see. For example, the Apple FBI dispute is as much about encryption as it is just the general discomfort on the government side that it's fallen behind and it doesn't know what to do. It's not driving the conversation anymore.
Yeah, well, I think the debate it goes around our governance infrastructure so fast because software can be downloaded to the phone to all of a sudden hail a taxi in France, but they don't have time to debate whether or not they want Uber in town. And then everybody gets angry because people are hailing Uber drivers, and so the horse leaves the barn before the infrastructure of governance can really take a look at the situation.
It's an interesting question about this idea of beta tests, right? So this is a great concept of let's push out our new technology, into the world, and before it's perfect, and the people who use it will let us know how to improve it. This is a tested, tried system, particularly for software. The challenge now as we see change in these bucket areas I mentioned in hardware, it's robotics or human performance modification, is beta testing, pushing it out in the real world before you work through not all, but at least some of the major implications of it, dilemmas of it, the fact that people are going to misuse it, either accidentally or deliberately, because the world has bad people in it. It comes with very real human costs and consequences. And you can see that disconnect, you can see that discomfort, for example, in the Tesla push of, and it's been very open about the fact that it's doing a beta test with its driverless car technology, human assist, however you want to frame it. But basically that it was pushed out, and some of it was clearly, parts of it weren't ready, and you've had accidents that people have died in. The company has said, sort of made two responses. One is a very clear, and I go back to this East Coast, West Coast, gave a classic engineers kind of statistician response saying, look, when you crunch the numbers, we've saved more people from accidents that didn't happen because of the technology versus the accident that did happen. That's arguably true, but also that's not how we sometimes work through issues in the social human side of things. And the philosopher side of this would be the classic the idea of the trolley, the runaway trolley phenomena. Right. And of course, your discomfort with killing 5 people versus killing a cute little kid, and then is it a deliberate choice or an accidental choice? And you don't want to go into that, but the point is that they give kind of very classic engineering response. And then the second thing is, shortly thereafter, they pushed out new technology, new upgrades that fixed it. Said, we've learned. Isn't this great? And again, this is where you get to this back and forth between the beta test or not, which is, well, gosh, couldn't we have tried to figure out a way to get this technology before we push it out so widely? And again, this is the back and forth, and people are, you'll see this now, the discourse over the taxis, robotic taxis being introduced into cities. Pittsburgh is an example where that's happening right now with Uber, despite the fact that there's really no good legal codes, policy around it, and people take different positions. People say, well, I would much rather get this rather than waiting for this slow, bulky government to get itself in order. And then, others push back, well, when things go wrong, how do we figure out how to handle it? How do we figure out accountability? And everything I just talked about, the same things play out in war. We've seen that, for example, recently with the discourse over drones, or remotely operated right now. The back and forth of we essentially kind of ended up with drone wars without having a policy debate about it, without having congressional authorization around it. Again, whether you like it or not, you can admit we didn't have the kind of discussion or debate, the decision. The same thing's playing out with autonomous robotics right now. We're moving towards them. It obviously raises a lot of deep, deep questions. Policy world's not ready for it. The laws are not ready for it, but we're pushing forward.
It's super interesting because the traditional methods of developing software, the waterfall methods, have now really don't support current needs of business and consumers. So now there's more agile. You release the code, and like Reid Hoffman says with LinkedIn, famously, if you're waiting for your software to be perfect, you're already too late. And that's really interesting because when we move over to the policy side, from a threat point of view, we're kind of launching before we've determined the philosophy or the debate around whether or not something is right or ethical. And I'd like you to talk about, like, our drones right now, aren't they 100% human being? Like, if a kill decision is made, doesn't it have to be made by a human being at this point, versus a lot of countries in the world that maybe don't have a human being in the loop? Is that true, or is that a false assumption?
So there's a number of different things you're touching on there. So first, on the U.S. versus global use, none of us are yet in fully autonomous world. We're not in the world of the Terminator. The way the technology is used still involves, in terms of, if you're thinking of drone strikes and whether it's Syria, Iraq, or the not-so-covert CIA operations in Pakistan, there's still a human in the loop. Human is making that decision. That time, that may change in the future, but right now the human's still in the loop. Same thing if we're looking at other actors' use of the technology. So, as I mentioned, roughly 80 militaries around the world have robotics. So far, I believe the number is 8 that have conducted drone strikes. So they're nations like Israel to Nigeria, Iran, Iraq. Most recently, Turkey claimed that it had conducted a drone strike. So now we get into this fun thing of kind of looking at the technology versus how we use it, where we use it, under what circumstances. So for the most part, the concern over drone strike campaigns is not the technology itself. It's how it changes the way we look at the politics of it, and most particularly where and when we conduct these strikes. And these ideas of, if you go back 15 years and said, we're going to be conducting more than 500 airstrikes into Pakistan, do you think that's a war? People would have said, yeah, 500 airstrikes. We don't see ourselves as being at war with or at war in Pakistan because they're drone strikes. And it's the way it's changed the media reporting, the political discourse. And there's a longer sort of it's because of not having to expose people to danger, et cetera. But again, it's not specifically the technology, it's how it's changed the politics of it. The idea, though, to go back to this sort of beta testing and release of technology, and you'll never get perfect software. 100% agreement. And that's why you need to remember that. And anyone who's sort of telling you, oh, this is going to be perfect, it's going to solve all our problems, they're full of it. Second thing, though, is that the focus may not always have to be on the technology, but again, where and when you use it. So, for example, if we're looking at a future of armed autonomous robotics, some people want an outright ban. Never use them anywhere. That may or may not be possible. We have a discussion, kind of debate around that. I don't think an outright ban is going to work. I just don't think the technology trend lines are going to allow it because we're going to be using more and more autonomous systems in civilian life. So to think somehow you'll be able to prevent it on the military side, I don't see it happening. Also because war sides are always trying to get a competitive advantage. So if one side thinks autonomous robotics are going to aid it, it's going to work on them because it thinks it's going to win them wars. But the point is not so much the technology, but you may be able to regulate where or how you use that technology. So, for example, if we're worried about civilian harm, we may be able to agree you can't use this in places where it's very easy for the robotic system to get confused, for civilians to be caught in the crossfire in a city. On the other hand, we may decide we're comfortable with them being used in domains where that's less likely. So, for example, in undersea warfare. Undersea warfare is actually highly automated already. The torpedoes, the way the sonars work, it's not like it is in the movies, Jonesy listening in with his really, really good ear. It's already computers, in essence, matching algorithms, torpedoes being fired off and hunting on their own. The point here is that we're already trending towards it, but also if things go wrong, you're less likely to harm civilians in undersea warfare because, well, we don't have civilian cruise liner submarines the way, for example, you could confuse a tank and a truck quite easily, or a soldier, an insurgent, and a reporter all look the same at a distance. So the point is, again, there may be locales where we're comfortable with it. These are the sort of issues we're going to have to work out.
So you wrote an article just recently about the use of robots in Dallas for lethal purposes, and it was very, very interesting. Again, this is probably, out in front of the debate. Nobody sat there and said, should this happen? It just happened. Am I correct with that, or was there debate prior to this happening?
The choice to use a robot in Dallas in a lethal manner was not something that was written into Dallas or more widely police doctrine, training, etc. The police on the scene, the police chief, have been very clear in saying that this is something that they came up with in the moment. They ad hoc'd it. they faced a very difficult situation, and they came up with an answer to it. Now, for me, the issue is not to Monday morning quarterback them, but to go, okay, what next? Is this a precedent that we want other police to follow? Is it something that we want technology companies to do? They've not previously been selling armed robotic systems to police. What do we want to happen here?
Sure.
And my concern is actually that we may be setting ourselves up for a kind of ironic and circular moment. So how we got into this in the first place, how we got to the situation of these police shootings in places that range from Minnesota to Ferguson in Missouri to Baton Rouge, that then led to the protests, that then had the sniper shooting at police at it. Basically, what we've seen play out is, in essence, each state, each local police department is making up their own, not making up, I don't want to use that. They each have their own approaches to their doctrine, their training requirements, how they interact with the public. They have their own histories of race relations. And to put it simply, some do it really well and some don't. So, for example, Ferguson police has a quite checkered history, a lot of problems there. The irony of the shootings in Dallas is that Dallas police had actually gone through a number of reforms and was widely known as one of the police departments that was doing really well. It had changed its relations with the civilian populace. Its numbers of shootings had gone down and the like. But so the point simply is, some are going to do it well, some are not.
Sure.
Do we want that with robotics? Do we want, Ferguson police coming up with its own way on how to use armed robots and Dallas doing it its own way, and none of them being informed by everything from technologists to law to public debate? I'm not comfortable with that. I actually don't want each and every little police department deciding how it's going to use armed robots or not. I'd rather us try and get ahead of this and start to figure it out at a national level.
Yeah, I think that's the importance right now of the debate, is get out ahead of the technologies and force the debates. I think as we wrap up, I'd love to give some listeners some of the some things that they can learn from. And one of the themes from your book and from your books and your writing material is the importance, and even your talk to Congress, was the importance of resilience. And I'd love to, and so this is a theme with a lot of my listeners, is creating, we're never going to be secure, we're never going to be 100% certain, and never have really, but certainly in these days. So how do you interpret resilience in the context of your domain that you spend most of your time? Like how could people be more resilient, either within the context of, for example, Estonia or some of these other examples that you've been using moving forward?
So when you're looking at cybersecurity, and whether it is you as an individual, you as a business leader, you're thinking about national security, too much of the discussion has been about defense and deterrence. Keep the bad guys out, scare the bad guys away. The reality is that will not work. On the keep the bad guys out, attackers will get in. It's just the nature of the beast. Oh, by the way, the attackers may already be on the inside. About 1/3 of the major breaches are caused by insiders. And that's true whether you're looking at, the most sophisticated organizations in the world, the NSA and Edward Snowden, to a small business and an employee is disgruntled because they didn't get a promotion. On the deterrent side, the reality is some attackers will be scared by threats to retaliate against them, and some won't. Just, again, the nature of it. Instead, we need to shift to an approach of resilience. And you can think about resilience in cybersecurity in two different ways. One is on the actual design, the actual approach. The other is on the psychological. So on the design side, rather than relying on kind of one single way of keeping them out, I like to think about when you're thinking about your networks, the parallel of the human body. Human body has an incredible external layer of defense. My skin right now, your skin, if you just look at your fingertip, it is stopping over 10 million attackers, keeping them out, just on your fingertip. The reality, though, is that that's not enough. Inside my body, inside your body, there are 10 times as many foreign attackers as there are human cells. Our body, though, plans for that. Our body is designed around it. It does things like, for example, channels the attackers into places where they can't cause as much harm, your gut. It has extra layers of defense, extra layers of security around its most important, parts of it, in what business we call the crown jewels. In your body, it's things like the skull around your brain, the rib cage.
Heart, sure.
Your body said, exactly, these are really important things. I'm going to protect them even more. I'm going to invest more in these parts. Your body has internal monitoring systems that are always active and always important, and very easy ways of signaling that something's amiss. You get a fever. Your body triages when an attacker penetrates and causes harm, recovers from it, etc. But there's also, we should be thinking about this in the design of our essentially network.
Basically, what you're talking to is like a biological metaphor, which is super, like, how does nature secure itself?
Exactly. The biological metaphor can also work when you think about the public-private interaction here. So health, there is no one actor can do it all, just like in cybersecurity. So you need federal government level public health investment, and that might be in anything research on diseases to information sharing programs. Oh, by the way, corporations work in public health, and that's everything from healthcare companies to your own, be it your retail company that puts out the sanitizer for hands, to all that doesn't matter if you don't have good personal hygiene. If you aren't, covering your mouth when you cough and the like. It's the same phenomena in cybersecurity. Everything matters. Everything needs to be working together in a holistic ecosystem. Anyone saying that, this one part can do it alone, they're wrong. But I want to get back to that resilience in terms of psychological resilience. Compare the way we think about cybersecurity versus the British mentality towards terrorism. Cyber 9/11, cyber Pearl Harbor, get scared, catastrophe, versus keep calm and carry on. Which mentality incentivizes attackers to come after you? That you are going to get hysteric, overreact. Oh, by the way, the difference for private business, invariably when breaches do happen, and the actual cost of the breach, and for some major corporations it's been a difference of millions of dollars in losses versus over $1 billion, has been how they handled their public affairs, how their legal team responded, how their C-suite responded, not
Sure.
the IT sector.
Absolutely.
But again, that idea of I'm going to be resilient, I'm going to design and think in a manner that plans for the bad and how I'm either going to power through it or get back up quickly when I've been knocked down. That's how we'll solve cybersecurity.
Yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that metaphor. And I was reading the blog post that you wrote for, I think it was Military Aviation Week, and you talked about the importance of air and space. And you also mentioned cybersecurity. You mentioned it was a two parts. We've already covered cyber. What is the importance of our satellites and our satellite infrastructure and the ability of our phones? Like, there's a whole world above us that I don't think I'm as fluent in, and you are. Could you just kind of give us the just a one-on-one version of what you think we need to be aware of regarding this moving forward from a resilience, either from a U.S. or a personal perspective?
So what we play with in Ghost Fleet is the idea of what would happen if there was an actual war in the present day through the 2020s. So when I say actual war, I mean the old school definition of a war, state-on-state conflict. That's not to say we haven't been in war, even though we haven't called it the last 15 years, but it's been against non-state actors' networks. What I mean is a return to not network threats, but states, Russia, China. What would a World War III style conflict look like? And one of the differences is that it would involve battles in all the domains not just on land, but domains that we haven't fought in for a long periods of time. The last time the U.S. Navy battled a peer at sea was over 70 years ago. The last time the U.S. Air Force battled a peer power in the air, it wasn't the Air Force, it was the Army Air Corps. But it would also involve battles in places we've never fought before, in cyberspace and outer space. And both those spaces are integral not just to the military but to the civilian side. And one of the issues of battles in these domains is that very quickly the lines between military and civilian would grow fuzzy or disappear. So if you're thinking about targets that you would go after in cyberspace, well, the medium itself, 98% of U.S. military communications go over the civilian-owned and operated internet. If you look at on the satellite side, for U.S. military satellite use, about 80% of it is on civilian satellites. So if you're going after these things that enable our military to operate well, cyberspace, outer space, if you're targeting them, you're inherently going to be hitting things that are civilian. You're going to be taking down GPS. You're going to be going after communications networks, etc. And so what I'm getting at is you'll have these strange aspects that the opening battles of such a war would be silent. Software doesn't speak, and as the Aliens movie put it, in space no one can hear you scream and things blow up and you don't hear them.
Yeah, right.
But they will resonate widely, not just in what the military can or no longer would be able to do. You take away GPS, everything from aircraft carriers to drones to missiles won't be able to operate either in the same way or at all. But it would also have impact on the civilian side. Take away GPS. It's not just I won't be able to find, where my in-laws live. Take away GPS, major business operations, the way companies like a Target or a Walmart do logistics depends on GPS, to trading on the stock market depends on, timestamps that rely on that.
Sure.
So very quickly it would have impact on the civilian side.
The internet timing systems, that a lot of the timing of just the gear that revolves most of it calls on the GPS and the timing systems.
Yeah, just like in past wars, the technology will introduce new questions, including just fundamental questions about what we call the home front. And the very idea of a home front was redefined by our ability to reach into the air. Planes and then bomber planes suddenly meant the battles were no longer just on the front lines. They could reach hundreds of miles back, and then it opened up these questions like, can you attack civilian cities or not? And, when should you not, et cetera. Same issues playing out now with cyberspace and outer space. The difference, though, is the inherent civilian nature of them. And then you get to these questions like, does it actually have to wait for an outright kind of classically defined war, or some of these things playing out in what we might call the gray spaces having the equivalent impact? So, there's probably some business executive listening to this going, you're saying, if a China conducts a cyber attack in the future, I'm dealing with this every day. And the massive campaign of intellectual property theft that has hit businesses that range from defense companies to energy companies to soft drink companies, furniture companies, all being attacked, to what's playing out in our political system, where we've seen Russian government-linked attacks. And again, so the fuzzy lines don't just affect the who, but also the when of how we define war and conflict itself.
Well, this has been a real pleasure, and I'm leaving my best question for last. But before we do that, I want to just ask you where my listeners can find more information about your book, Ghost Fleet, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, Wired for, all of your material, both published. Where can they engage with that best? That would you prefer to have on the show notes?
The easiest is your local bookstore, which has now been defined as the bookstore physically down the street, to your local bookstore that's inside that computer, your Amazon, Barnes & Nobles online, et cetera. They're all available there, and I hope people enjoy them. For each book, though, there is a website that has sort of added extras. So there's ghostfleetbook.com, and for example, it has even a soundtrack that's linked to the book, imagery. So for example, the book is about conflict in the future. We commissioned a number of artists and people from advertising agencies to imagine what would the war posters of the future look like. So there's a lot of fun extras at ghostfleetbook.com. Same thing at cybersecuritybook.com has resources for people. Again, everything from a soundtrack, what are the songs that make you think of cybersecurity, to tools for businesses and even teachers that are using it as a teaching resource. And then for all my work, you mentioned a couple of articles. They're all at pwsinger.com. It's just like my personal website.
Yeah, and I highly recommend the book site. I'm staring at the hardcover of Ghost Fleet right now, and I've enjoyed your resources and your material. And part of me thinks that we need a huge software upgrade for human beings and to deal with kind of the acceleration that we're building digitally. And you had mentioned human performance, and I think you called it Wetware. And I'm fascinated about this from a leader. So leaders are on this phone that want to upgrade or start to explore upgrading their own performance. Where do you go to personally that you could direct people to learn more about what they can do? Is there any reason?
I'm going to do a little bit of an awful thing and say, wait.
Oh, that's the next piece, right?
Wait. But no, again, the point in all of this is that as much of the leader task is staying informed and trying to track not one but various news sources from multiple different fields, being informed, being aware of your environment, your ecosystem, your marketplace, that's how you survive. That's how you thrive. And that's true. We know that in business. We know that, from the science side. It's not the animal that runs the fastest. It's the one that adapts to its circumstances that lives on. That's Darwin taught us that. So again, it's been really cool, fun conversation. Hope people are able to check out some of the books again. Whether it's on Amazon or ghostfleetbook.com and cybersecuritybook.com. But it's been real fun chatting with you on these things. Lots of big meaty topics that aren't going away.
Peter, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
So this wraps up my conversation and discussion with Peter Singer. I hope you enjoyed it. I just deeply love these conversations that I'm having with these experts. Go to the show notes page at redzonetech.net/podcasts if you want to get access to any of Peter's books and his material online, which is significant. In addition to that, if you've enjoyed the show, please take it a couple extra seconds, hit the app on your phone, whether it's a Stitcher app for Droid or the iTunes podcast app, and just click on the picture of the sword and the person holding the sword, which is the show image, and you'll see a way there where you can just leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. It really helps the show out quite a bit. Additionally to that, you can leave a comment on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Anything to help amplify the positive effects of the show would be greatly appreciated. So with that, this is Bill Murphy, your host. I deeply appreciate you listening to the show, and I really look forward to seeing you next time on the next episode. Thank you, and I'm signing off. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.